Assalamu alaikum. So today we're going to be discussing Surah Ar-Rum, which is chapter 30 in the Quran, which is a very beautiful surah in the Quran that has a lot of really nice meanings. And of course, we're not going to cover all of the meanings. That would be a lot, but we're just going to give some highlights, inshallah. So let's start right from the beginning. The first verse is Alif Lam Mim. Then the second verse is Ghulibatir Rum, meaning Ar-Rum have been conquered or overcome or defeated. Now, what does Ar-Rum refer to? Historically, this is usually interpreted as meaning the Romans, and it's talking about the battle between the Romans and the Persian Empire. So, not that it can't mean that historically, but the Quran is a universal book. It's a book of universal truths for all people in all times. So anytime we look at historical events in the Quran, we don't want to just limit our understanding to that historical meaning. We want to ask ourselves and try to think about how that meaning could apply universally for all times. So one of the ways that we can do that is going back to the root words in Arabic. The root words help us understand the universal application of the term or the concept in the Quran. So what's the root word for Ar-Rum? What's the three-letter root indicate? What does the three-letter root indicate? Ra, Waw, and Mim. That's the root word. So in Arabic, one of the meanings of that is, or that root word is, talabu shay. It means to seek something. So perhaps another more universal, more comprehensive way of thinking about Ar-Rum here is the seekers. Ghulibat Ar-Rum. The seekers have been overcome or have been defeated. Now, what does that mean? Let's keep reading. I think it will explain it. So the very next verse says, Fi adna al-ard, in the nearest land. So this word nearest, adna, is the masculine form of the same meaning as the word ad-dunya, which we usually use for al-hayatu dunya, meaning the nearest life, right? We talk about this life that we live, al-hayatu dunya, being an illusion and all the different things that we talk about al-hayatu dunya, and it's going to come up in some verses soon. Adna, nearest, is the masculine form of that word. So I think it's really interesting that he starts off saying, Ghulibatir Rum, which we could perhaps interpret as the seekers have been defeated and overcome. Fi adna al-ard, in the nearest land, just like ad-dunya. So perhaps there's a metaphysical or metaphorical interpretation of this, or a way to look at this, that those who are seeking the akhirah, those who are seeking the higher values, those who are seeking not this world, but another world that's deeper, another dimension that's beyond this, those who are seeking spiritual truths, those who are seeking knowledge, in this, fi adna al-ard, in the nearest land, in this world that we live in, that's the nearest and the closest to them, this physical world that we live in, that's deceiving and that is beautified and sometimes draws us away. Ghulibat Ar-Rum. These seekers are sometimes defeated in this particular place. And that's so beautiful. We're going to continue reading here because it's going to add to this discussion. But what's so beautiful about this is Surah Ar-Rum, chapter 30, comes right after Surah Al-Ankabut, chapter 29. And what's at the beginning of Surah Al-Ankabut? Listen to the beginning of Surah Al-Ankabut. Alif Lam Mim, أحسب الناس أن يتركوا أن يقولوا آمنا وهم لا يفتنون. It says, do people think that they will be left alone by saying we have believed and they will not be tested? Then the next verse, وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. And truly we tested those who were before them. فَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا. So Allah will come to know those who are truthful. وَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ الْكَاذِبِينَ. And He will truly know those who are lying. So Surah Al-Ankabut starts off with letting us know that we will go through tests, right? And then how does Surah Al-Ankabut end? وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا, the last ayah, verse 69, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا, and those who strive hard in our cause, لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا, we will truly guide them to our paths. وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمَعَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, and truly Allah is with those who do good. So it begins, Surah Al-Ankabut, chapter 29, begins talking about we will go through tests in life, right? And then it ends telling us that What's our way of dealing with these tests? What's our way of dealing with these experiences that we have in life, that we have to continue to struggle and strive in the cause of Allah? وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا, those who strive and struggle hard, لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. So even though it starts with the test, but it reassures us and comforts us in the end that as long as we keep struggling, we will be guided, he says, subulana, to our paths, to many different paths, right? So it's beautiful because it's kind of telling us this journey of starting off with this struggle and this hardship and this test. But as long as you keep struggling, it won't always be like that. وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمَعَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, it says, and Allah is with those who do good. And so subhanAllah, the next surah opens up with Alif Lam Mim, Ghulibat Ar-Rum. Alif Lam Mim, the Ar-Rum have been overcome or have been defeated. Fi adna al-ard, just in the nearest, right? So it's kind of drawing our attention to, in the nearest, most immediate way, it looks like they've been defeated. But as long as they keep struggling, as long as the seekers of the akhirah, as long as the seekers of knowledge, as long as the seekers of higher values keep struggling, Allah is with them, and they will be again victorious. And even if it seems fi adna al-ard, in the nearest, meaning on the surface of what people can see, as we're going to see if we keep reading, it's going to point us to that kind of an idea. Even if it seems on the surface, from what people can see, that they've been defeated, but that's just because that's how people look at things. That's how people see things, just on the surface. They don't see the deeper success that we have, even if it's not in a material sense. The success of having peace, the success of having beautiful knowledge with which we perceive the world, the success of having beautiful character. A lot of people don't see that. They just see the material success. They just see the surface. So even though the seekers have been defeated and overcome fi adna al-ard, in the nearest land, in the nearest viewpoint, however, as the verse continues, وَهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ غَلَبِهِمْ سَيَغْلِبُونَ, and after their defeat, they will be victorious. سَيَغْلِبُونَ. SubhanAllah, beautiful. And I'm going to come back to this point in a second, because we want to tie this to another verse in another part of the Quran. But I want to keep reading for a second here to continue this theme. So then he says in the next verse, fi bid'i sinin, in a few odd years, right? So in not that much time. It seems like it's going to take a lot of time. And isn't that the case though? When we're going through something, it seems like it's going to be forever. It seems like it's going to take forever for us to work through that. I know there's been situations in my life where when I was in that situation, I didn't see, or I couldn't perceive how this situation would play out and how things would turn out for the better. But now that I'm past that situation, whatever that situation might have been, and there's been quite a few for me, and I'm sure for you too. Now, when I'm in this different stage of my life and things are working out in a different way, and I look back on that particular situation, it seems so long ago. And I can't believe that I got so caught up in the situation of feeling like it would never end, right? And that's going to be a continuous thing, because even though I've come out of those situations, but there's going to always be things that pop up that at the moment is going to seem like it has utmost importance. But wahum min ba'di ghalabihim sayaghlibun, as long as we are seekers of higher truths, of higher dimensions, we will again be victorious. Fi bid'i sinin, and it won't be that long, just a few numbered years. Then he says, Lillahi al-amru min qablu wa min ba'd. To Allah belongs the amr, the command, the system, the rules, the regulations, the laws, the principles. Min qablu wa min ba'd, from before and from after. Wa yawma idhin yafrahul mu'minun. And on that day, the believers will experience joy. You will experience joy when you realize that you're seeking paid off. You're seeking knowledge. You're seeking to be a better person. It's always going to pay off. And that takes us back to the end of the previous surah, Surah Al-Ankabut, where he says, وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمَعَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, and Allah is with those who do good. So Allah is with those who do good. And after a while of that struggling and striving, when you start to see your efforts pay off, وَيَوْمَئِذٍ يَفْرَحُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, and those who kept their faith, those who didn't lose their faith, will feel joy on that day. What will they feel joy with? بِنَصْرِ اللَّهِ, with the help of Allah. يَنْصُرُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ, He helps whomsoever He wills. وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الرَّحِيمُ. And he is the mighty and the merciful. And then he says in the next verse, and this is the way these verses progress here too, is another reason I think you can, when you read these next two verses, verse 6 and 7, and you apply them back to the beginning of the surah, I think verses 6 and 7 give us the overall theme of what we're supposed to be taking from the beginning of the surah and the surah as a whole. And that's why I said when we look at the words Ar-Rum and their defeat and these different words, we can interpret them in a universal way and not just think about them as referring to like a historical circumstance only because of these next two verses. Because after he talks about Ar-Rum were defeated in the nearest land and they will again be victorious, and that day the believers will feel joy with the help of Allah. He tells us in verse 6, Wa'ad Allah. This is the promise of Allah. This is the promise of Allah that if you keep seeking and you keep striving, even though you may experience moments of defeat and moments of feeling like you're overcome by all these different forces, but if you keep persisting, Allah is with al-muhsineen and you will again be victorious and you will feel joy on that day. Wa'ad Allah. And this is the promise of Allah. La yukhlifu Allahu wa'dahu. And Allah does not violate or break his promise. And then he ends the verse by saying, وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. See, this is the overall universal truth in the end of this verse and the next verse that we're getting from this surah. However, most people don't have knowledge. وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. However, most people don't have knowledge. But then in the next verse, 7, he tells us that they do have knowledge of something. So he negates knowledge from them, like in general, but then he comes back and says they do have knowledge of something. So he negates knowledge from them, but there's something that they do have knowledge of. And what is that? Most people. يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. And so this is where we can apply this back to the beginning of the surah. They know ظَاهِرًا, a surface view of al-hayat dunya, as we usually translate it, the life of this world. But as I explained earlier, ad-dunya means the nearest. So al-hayat dunya, they know the surface of the nearest life. They know what just appears right in front of them, what they can see. They don't think any deeper than that. They're just surface. And here also is really interesting because the word for surface or what appears or what manifests, the word zahir, is in the indefinite form. What that means is if it said al-zahir, ya'lamuna al-zahira min al-hayat dunya, the surface, they only know the surface. That means there's one surface, there's one appearance, right? But ya'lamuna zahiran, they know a surface, meaning even when it comes to the surface, there are many different viewpoints and surface perspectives on al-hayat dunya, right? And they know a surface. They know one of them. They know one appearance, right? So that's beautiful. Most people, even when it comes to the surface, only know the surface in some indefinite way. They don't know all of the surface, right? So that's beautiful because he tells us most people don't have knowledge. They only know a surface meaning of al-hayat dunya. So when you apply that back to the beginning of the surah, that supports a lot of what we've been talking about. That perhaps the greater lesson from the surah is not the historical thing, but it's reminding us that when you're seeking higher values, sometimes you will be defeated and overcome. But don't take that as a defeat in reality, because true success is not that material success. It's not what's just in al-hayat dunya, just what people can see in front of them. But most people don't realize that because they only know zahiran min al-hayat dunya. They only know the surface. And even when we interpret those words, ar-rum, and these different words as to seek something, talabu shay, the seekers, some people might say, well, no, that just refers to the Romans. Again, back to this verse, they only know the surface. So even when we look at the Quran, a lot of us only look at it on the surface, only look at the surface of the word, but there's deeper meanings to it than that. And then he says at the end here, وَهُمْ عَنِ الْآخِرَةِ هُمْ غَافِلُونَ. They only know a surface of al-hayat dunya, but they are ghafilun. They are heedless of al-akhirah, of the hereafter, or what comes later. They only know what's immediate, right? So that's a beautiful start to the surah, verses 1 through 7. Now, what I want to connect this with real quick, because we're talking about the seekers, right? And we're talking about how they might be momentarily or temporarily defeated or seem to be defeated on the surface, right? And connecting that with people only seeing things on the surface of al-hayat dunya. But I want to connect this with another idea. So when you go, we went up to verse 7. When you go right over to verse 20, Surah Ar-Rum is very unique in the way that it presents the ayats, the signs and the lessons of Allah, beginning from verse 20 up to verse 25. It's very unique in the presentation, right? Because it's going to give us verse after verse that's going to tell us part of his ayat is this and part of his ayat is that. So I'm going to read it to you real quick. And that's why I said we're only giving thoughts from the surah or some reflections, because all of this should be unpacked, right? But I want to read these to you because I want us to connect the idea of this unique presentation of ayat with, with the idea that this surah talks about in the beginning, the seekers of higher values will eventually be victorious, and how this relates to that, and how that tells us the means to being victorious. And we're going to connect that to another place in the Quran. But first, let's start with verse 20. He says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَكُمْ مِنْ تُرَابٍ ثُمَّ إِذَا أَنْتُمْ بَشَرٌ تَنْتَشِرُونَ. And from his ayat, from his signs and lessons, is that he created you from dust, and then you are human beings which are spread out. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, look how he starts off each verse. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا, that he created for you from your own selves mates and pairs, لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, so that you can dwell with them in tranquility. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and he placed between you love and mercy. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. In that are ayat, are signs and lessons for people who think and reflect. So what I want you to really pay attention to also is how in the rest of these verses, starting from this verse, at the end of each verse, the ayat are for a different group of people. So that's something we need to contemplate about this surah. Why in each verse, each presentation of ayat, does he say there's different characteristics of people that these ayat are for? So meaning, and Allah knows best, that if we want to perceive these specific ayat in each verse, we need to work on these particular characteristics, that people with these characteristics will perceive these ayat. So the ayat about creating for you mates from yourselves and placing between you love and mercy, those are ayats for people who yatafakkarun, for people who think and reflect. Why? Why are those ayat for people who think and reflect? And then the next verse, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, and from his signs and lessons, خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, is the creation of the heavens and the earth. وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ, and the variation in your tongues and colors. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالِمِينَ. In that are ayat for people who have knowledge, right? So completely different group of people or completely different characteristics. So when I say group of people, I don't mean that one group of people or one person can't understand all of these ayat, but it's giving us different characteristics of people that will understand these particular ayat. So if we want to understand all of the ayat, then we have to have all of the characteristics. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, the next verse, مَنَامُكُمْ بِاللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ وَابْتِغَاؤُكُمْ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. And from his ayat is your sleeping by night and day, and your seeking of his bounty. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَسْمَعُونَ. In that are ayat, are signs and lessons for people who listen. Verse 24. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, and from his signs and lessons, يُرِيكُمُ الْبَرْقَ خَوْفًا وَطَمَعًا, is that he shows you the lightning out of fear and hope. وَيُنَزِّلُ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً, and he sends down from the sky water. فَيُحْيِي بِهِ الْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ مَوْتِهَا, So he brings to life by it the earth after its death. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ. In that are signs and lessons for people who use their intellect. And finally in verse 25, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, and from his signs and lessons, أَن تَقُومَ السَّمَاءُ وَالْأَرْضُ بِأَمْرِهِ, that as-sama'u wal-ard, the heavens and the earth, stand by his amr, by his command, by his system of laws and principles and rules and regulations. ثُمَّ إِذَا دَعَاكُمْ دَعْوَةً مِّنَ الْأَرْضِ إِذَا أَنْتُمْ تَخْرُجُونَ. Then when he calls you a call from the earth, then إِذَا أَنْتُمْ تَخْرُجُونَ, then you will come forth. So he mentions his ayats in a very beautiful and unique way in Surah Ar-Rum, in all these different verses, and he gives us different characteristics of people that will understand and benefit from each type of ayah, each group of ayats. But the point I want to really focus on today, because we can break all of that down, that's a whole different video, and inshallah we'll come to that. But the point I want to focus on today is why, if we're starting off this Surah Ar-Rum, with the presentation of the seekers and how they're defeated in the nearest land, and about the outward appearance of al-hayat dunya, and how the seekers will, after they're being defeated, they will again be victorious and they will rejoice. The believers, those who didn't lose faith, will rejoice on that day. Why in this surah, like shortly after that, is there a very unique presentation of all of these different ayats? Perhaps it's telling us that this is how you become victorious, by connecting to the ayat, by connecting to the signs and lessons of Allah in his book and all around you. And as a support for that, we're going to go to 28:35. This is a very beautiful verse, and this is a verse that is talking about Harun and Musa, Aaron and Moses. So I'll just read the end of the verse, but you can read the whole verse yourself. It's 28:35. He says, وَنَجْعَلُ لَكُمَا سُلْطَانًا, and we will make for you an authority, فَلَا يَصِلُونَ إِلَيْكُمَا, so they will not be able to reach you, they will not be able to harm you, in other words, بِآيَاتِنَا أَنْتُمَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَكُمَا الْغَالِبُونَ, the same word. He says, by our ayat, by our signs and lessons, you and whoever follows you two and whoever follows you two are al-ghalibun, are the victorious, or those who will overcome. So it is by the ayat that he told Musa and Harun they will be able to be victorious and to overcome. So it's so interesting. In the beginning of Surah Ar-Rum, he talks about they were overcome, ghulibat, but then sayaglibun, they will be able to overcome and be victorious again. And then shortly after, he has this long, unique presentation of these different groups of ayat and these characteristics of people who will be able to comprehend and benefit from them. So it is by the ayat that Ar-Rum, those who are seeking higher things, will again be victorious. So I encourage you, and I encourage myself, to try to connect to the ayat in the book and in the universe. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.